On a cold, gray afternoon, a powerful CEO thought he had seen everything life could take from him until he heard the quietest voice on the steps of a community dance hall. A little girl in a lavender dress whispered, "It's the daddy dance, and I'm alone." In that instant, the world stopped. What began as a simple offer for one dance would unravel grief, awaken hope, and build something neither of them expected, a family. This story isn't just about kindness. It's about second chances, the courage to open your heart again, and the magic that happens when love finds you in the most unexpected places. Stay with us, because what happens next may just change the way you see your own life. And don't forget, subscribe to the Retold Stories for more true journeys of healing, love, and connection. The air in Portland carried the kind of silence that comes after rain, when the world seems washed but still heavy with memories. Jackson Reed stepped out of the sleek black car without waiting for his driver. He had told the man simply, "Give me 20, though he didn't know what he wanted those 20 minutes for. Perhaps it was escape. Perhaps it was the search for something that could not be found in the towers of glass he usually inhabited. His polished shoes tapped against the wet pavement, but inside he felt hollow, each step echoing with a grief he had not been able to bury. Jackson was not just anyone. Forbes had labeled him a visionary, the stoic face of Solterra Clean Tech, a man who stood on stages with steady hands and unwavering promises. But those glossy magazine covers did not show the nights when he lay awake staring at ceilings, when the loss of his wife Claire pressed on him like an unending weight. It had been a full year since cancer took her, yet the ache was fresh, cruelly familiar every morning. His life had not collapsed in the public eye. He still signed contracts, still shook hands, still delivered confident speeches, but within, every breath felt like a battle. That day, he wandered into a neighborhood he didn't recognize. Old brick buildings lined the street, with storefronts that smelled of bread, detergent, and coffee. For the first time in months, he heard birdsong unaccompanied by the hum of machinery, and he let it wash over him. It was then that he noticed a chalkboard sign outside a modest building wedged between a laundromat and a vegan cafe. Annual Father-Daughter Dance, 5 p.m. The words, written in curly white chalk, should have meant nothing to him, but they pulled at something deep, a reminder of milestones he and Claire had never reached. At first, Jackson intended to keep walking. He was not a father, not a man who belonged in such celebrations. But his stride faltered when he saw her. A small figure sat on the steps, her lavender dress pressed neatly over her knees, white shoes scuffed from wear. Her ribbons had slipped slightly in her hair, yet it was clear someone had prepared her carefully, as if this evening mattered more than words could say. She was no older than 7, maybe even younger, and she sat very still, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. There were no sobs, no dramatic cries, only the quiet heartbreak of a child who already knew too well how loneliness felt. Jackson froze, unsure what to do. The man he had been before the loss, before the hollowing, would have walked past. He would have told himself it wasn't his place, that kindness belonged to someone else. But the sight of her pierced something buried. He found himself rooted to the sidewalk, watching as her tiny shoulders trembled. Then her voice rose, small but sharp against the gray afternoon. "It's the daddy dance," she whispered, "and I'm alone." The words struck him with the force of memory. He remembered nights of staring into emptiness, the echo of Claire's absence, the unbearable silence of his penthouse. Her voice was not just a child's complaint, it was a mirror of his own soul. Before he could rationalize, his knees bent, the expensive fabric of his suit creasing, as he crouched before her. When she looked up, her eyes were like sea glass, fragile, clear, and carrying storms within. He opened his mouth, unsure what he could offer, and then simply said, "Well, how about you borrow me for one dance?" For a second she blinked, as if he had spoken in another language. Then her lips trembled into a faint smile. "Really?" she asked. Jackson nodded. "Just for tonight. I warn you, I've got 2 left feet." Her small hand reached out, hesitant but hopeful, and when his fingers closed around hers, warmth shot through him like a current. It wasn't just the softness of her palm, it was the trust, the quiet belief that he could fill a space in her world, even if only for an evening. He had not felt alive in so long, and suddenly, life surged back in the simplest gesture. The door to the dance hall opened, spilling laughter and music into the street. Inside, fathers twirled daughters beneath strings of paper lanterns. The little girl tugged at his hand. They said I could still come without a dad, but it's better if I have one. Even if it's just for tonight. Jackson let her lead him in. And in that moment, something cracked within him. Not loudly, not shattering, but like a hairline fracture in stone, where light might finally seep through. Her name, he would later learn, was Maddie. But for now, she was simply a child in lavender who made him feel less alone. The hall was a blur of color and sound, yet Jackson felt strangely still. He stood stiff at first, his tailored suit too rigid for such a place, but Maddie beamed, her small fingers clutching his, as if she had been waiting for this all along. "You just have to loosen your knees," she instructed after a few clumsy steps. "Robots can't dance." Her giggle was infectious, breaking something locked inside him. For the first time in months, he laughed, truly laughed, as she spun in circles, tiara sliding sideways. He caught her when she stumbled, and again, that electric warmth flooded his chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't obligation. It was belonging. As the music played on, Jackson realized that in following her lead, he was doing more than dancing. He was stepping back into life. Each twirl, each giggle, each shared glance was a thread weaving him into a story he hadn't expected to join. He hadn't come here looking for redemption, but it had found him nonetheless, wrapped in the hand of a little girl who believed the world could still say yes to her. And perhaps, he thought, she was right. Julia Cooper pushed open the door to her apartment with a kind of weariness that seeps all the way into the bones. 12 hours at the hospital had left her shoulders knotted and her eyes burning. The night had been a blur of emergencies, shouting, the relentless beeping of machines, and too many moments where life itself balanced on a razor's edge. She dropped her bag near the door and let out a sigh that was less relief than surrender. This was her routine, survival stitched together with double shifts and strong coffee. But that night something unexpected awaited her. Her neighbor greeted her with a knowing smile and a phone in hand. "Maddie had the time of her life," she said gently. Confused, Julia frowned until the screen was pressed into her palm. There, frozen in a candid photograph, was Maddie in her lavender dress, mid-laugh, holding the hand of a man in a gray suit. Not posed, not polite, he was laughing too. Julia's chest tightened. Who was this man, and why did Maddie's joy look so unshakably real beside him? Her daughter rushed into her arms moments later, brimming with stories. "He picked me, Mommy," Maddie declared, tiara tilting as her excitement spilled over. Julia tried to smile, but her heart pulsed with unease. Strangers did not belong in their fragile world. Yet Maddie's glowing face was undeniable proof that someone had touched her life in a way Julia hadn't seen in years. Days later, when a message came 5 simple words, "Maddie would like to say thank you," Julia hesitated. Her instincts screamed caution, but something softer urged her to allow this moment. And so, on a quiet afternoon, she opened her door to find Jackson Reed standing awkwardly on the threshold with a bouquet of daisies in his hand and nerves written across his face. Maddie's squeal shattered any doubt. She leapt into his arms with unguarded joy, the kind reserved for children who still believed in miracles. Julia stood behind, scrubs still clinging to her, exhaustion etched on her skin, trying to measure the man before her. His posture wasn't slick or calculated. It was hesitant, humble, like someone unaccustomed to being invited into such an intimate space. He offered the flowers with a softness she hadn't expected. "For Maddie," he said, then added almost shyly, "or maybe for both of you." Julia accepted with a polite nod, though her guard remained firm. Inside, their small apartment revealed truths no polished surface could hide. The couch sagged in the middle. Utility bills sat stacked neatly but unpaid on the coffee table. Crayon drawings covered the fridge, bright rainbows, stick figures, animals with smiling faces. It was a space worn thin by struggle, but made alive by love. Jackson's sharp eyes noticed it all, not with judgment, but with quiet reverence. He knelt beside Maddie as she proudly showed him her sticker collection, listening as though each page were a treasure map. Julia watched from the kitchen, brewing coffee, her mind wrestling with contradictions. He looked too polished to belong here, yet his laughter with her daughter felt startlingly natural. When he finally took a cup from her hand, he didn't speak first. He simply sat, grounding the silence, until Julia murmured, "She hasn't stopped. Talking about you." Jackson looked down at the steam curling from his mug. "She saved me that night," he admitted softly. Julia raised an eyebrow. "Saved you?" He nodded, voice catching. "I lost my wife a year ago, Claire. We never had children. We kept saying we'd wait until it was too late. Maddie reminded me that my heart wasn't gone, it was just waiting." Something shifted in Julia's expression, a flicker of empathy that surprised her. She hadn't let anyone close in years, not since Maddie's father walked out without warning, leaving them to build a life from fragments. Yet she recognized the truth in his tone. Loss had carved both of them open, though in different ways. Their conversations were sparse at first, woven between Maddie's enthusiastic interruptions. But in those gaps, Julia noticed the steadiness of his presence. He didn't push. He didn't boast. He simply stayed listening, repairing a squeaky hinge, fixing a leaky faucet with more determination than skill. Maddie adored him, her laughter echoing through the apartment in ways Julia hadn't heard in too long. Still, fear lingered. Julia's world was small for a reason, walls built to protect her daughter, to protect herself. Yet Jackson's presence kept seeping through those cracks like sunlight. And then, the letter arrived. One evening, Julia sifted through the mail and froze at a familiar scrawl on a plain envelope. Her chest tightened as she opened it. The words inside dripped with entitlement, not love. Maddie's father, Chase Duran, wanted back into their lives. He had abandoned them years ago, but now he wrote as though he could claim his place at will. Julia's hands shook with fury. He hadn't earned a single moment of Maddie's joy. Not after birthdays spent in silence, not after nights she cried herself to sleep, asking why her daddy never came. When Jackson read the letter, his jaw clenched. He set it down gently and reached for Julia's hand. "Whatever happens," he said firmly, "you won't face this alone. We'll fight together." It had been years since anyone had stood beside her without hesitation. His words struck harder than she expected. The following weeks were a storm. Chase filed for joint custody, claiming remorse and redemption, twisting his absence into a narrative of misunderstanding. Julia felt fear gnaw at her resolve, but Jackson refused to waver. He brought in a family lawyer, gathered evidence of Chase's neglect, and stood by Julia's side through every anxious night. Maddie, once radiant, grew quieter under the tension. She clung to Julia at bedtime, eyes wide with unspoken worry. One night, she looked up at Jackson and whispered, "Will you still be my daddy, Jackson, if that man comes back?" Jackson's heart twisted. He brushed her hair gently and whispered, "Always, I'm still yours, no matter what." Julia stood in the doorway, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. What began as one borrowed dance was becoming something larger, something undeniable. This wasn't about charity, nor about filling emptiness. It was about belonging, about choosing each other, even when life tried to pull them apart. And though the court battle loomed ahead, though the fear of losing lingered, Julia began to realize something she hadn't in years. She wasn't carrying this weight alone anymore. The courtroom was hushed, a solemn place where lives could be reshaped by a gavel's strike. Julia sat at the long wooden table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Beside her was Ben Michaels, the attorney Jackson had trusted, and on her other side sat Jackson himself. He didn't speak, didn't offer flowery promises, he was simply there, a steady presence radiating calm. Across the aisle, Chase Duran sat with a smug expression, his suit crisp, his beard neatly trimmed, his gold watch flashing beneath the fluorescent lights. To anyone else, he looked respectable, repentant even. But Julia saw what lay behind it. Arrogance, entitlement. The belief that walking away for 3 years could be erased with a signature and a smile. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, began the proceedings. Julia's heart raced as Ben laid out the truth. Chase had abandoned his child, offered no support, no calls, no visits, and now, conveniently, he reappeared when Julia's life showed signs of stability. Chase's attorney countered with words like remorse and redemption, painting him as a man humbled by mistakes and desperate to reclaim his role as a father. Julia clenched her fists. Lies were easy to dress up, but they still smelled of betrayal. Then came the moment Julia dreaded most. The judge requested to hear from Maddie privately. Julia's chest tightened, but Ben touched her arm. "She's stronger than you know," he whispered. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Julia paced in the hallway while Jackson sat with his hands folded, calm but tense. When the door finally opened, Maddie walked out with steady steps, her expression unreadable, but her small chin lifted high. The child psychologist smiled reassuringly. "She did very well." Back in the courtroom, the judge cleared her throat. "This case is unusual," she began, but not without clarity. When asked about her father, Maddie said, "My real dad didn't leave. He helped me at the dance. He came back when he didn't have to. That's the kind of dad I want." Silence flooded the room. Julia pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Jackson closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Chase's confident smirk faltered, collapsing under the weight of a truth too pure to challenge. The ruling was swift. "Mr. Duran," the judge said firmly, "your petition for joint custody is denied. The law prioritizes the child's best interest, and you have demonstrated a complete lack of involvement for years. This matter is closed." The gavel struck. Just like that, the storm was over. Outside the courthouse, Julia felt the world tilt differently. Relief and exhaustion mingled in her chest. She turned to Jackson, eyes wet. "She chose you," she whispered. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I didn't expect that." "She meant it," Julia said softly. He didn't reply. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, not as a savior, not as a shield, but simply as a man who had chosen to stand beside her. For the first time in years, Julia let herself be held, really held. That evening, Julia tucked Maddie into bed. "Are we safe now?" Maddie asked sleepily. Julia kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, better than safe. And Daddy Jackson will stay forever?" Julia hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Would you like that?" Maddie's answer was instant. "I love him." Julia's throat tightened as she whispered, "Me too." From then on, their lives wove together seamlessly, not through grand gestures, but through the simple rhythms of everyday love. Jackson brought groceries without asking, helped with spelling words, strung new shelves above the sink. Maddie's laughter echoed through the apartment again, louder and freer, no longer dimmed by fear. One evening, Jackson stood on their tiny porch stringing cheap cafe lights above their heads. Maddie decorated with tissue paper flowers, insisting it was a real dance floor now. Julia leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, smiling despite herself. 6 square feet, she teased. "Not much room," Jackson grinned, stepping toward her. "Just enough for us." They swayed beneath the glow of the lights. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but with a kind of presence that needed no music. Julia felt his thumb brushing her knuckles, a steady reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. Later that night, Jackson reached into his pocket with trembling hands. "I had a plan," he admitted nervously. "A fancy dinner, violin music, but then I realized, this porch is better. This is where you laughed in your oldest hoodie, where Maddie showed me her first crayon drawing. This porch is real." He opened a small velvet box, revealing a delicate gold ring with an emerald flanked by 2 diamonds. His voice was raw, honest. "I don't want to be a maybe. Not for her, not for you. I want to wake up with you, argue over groceries, grow old in a home full of love. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as she whispered, "Yes." Maddie, peeking from the window, ran to her craft box and quickly scrawled glittery letters on paper. "I told you we were already a family." She presented it proudly when Jackson and Julia stepped inside, sealing a truth they all already knew. A year later, the same community hall glittered with paper lanterns for another father-daughter dance. But this time, Jackson didn't stumble upon it by chance. He arrived early, carrying baby Ellie in a soft wrap. While Maddie twirled ahead in her blue satin dress, Julia stood nearby, radiant, the wedding band catching light on her finger. Maddie led her dance group confidently, tiara perfectly in place. When a younger girl tripped, she reached out without hesitation, steadying her before continuing. Jackson's eyes brimmed with pride as he clapped the loudest, his heart swelling with gratitude for a life he never expected to find. Later that evening, Maddie presented him with another drawing, 4 stick figures under a banner that read, "My Family." A tall man, a woman in scrubs, a girl in a tiara, and a baby with rosy cheeks, all holding hands beneath a giant heart. "You chose me," Jackson whispered, voice breaking. Maddie grinned. "You didn't walk past." He pulled her close, one arm around her, the other cradling baby Ellie, with Julia beside him. And in that moment, he knew the dance had never ended. It had only just begun. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Sometimes it takes a single step, a single choice, to change everything. For Jackson, that step was stopping on a rainy Portland sidewalk instead of walking past. For Maddie, it was holding out her tiny hand and trusting that the world might still say yes. For Julia, it was daring to lower her guard and let someone in after years of surviving alone. What began as a dance borrowed for one night became the foundation of a family. A widowed man rediscovered his heart. A little girl found the father she had longed for. A weary mother discovered that love could return not as a storm of promises, but as a steady presence that never let go. Together they rewrote what family meant, not tied by blood, but by choice, by devotion, and by the courage to stay. This story reminds us that love often enters quietly. In the simplest of moments, a laugh shared, a hand held, a promise whispered in the dark. It doesn't always look like the fairy tales we imagine. Sometimes it looks like burnt garlic bread in a tiny kitchen, blanket forts held up by chairs, or porch lights strung across a narrow railing. It looks like being chosen, again and again, in the ordinary days that make a life. Maybe you've felt that same ache of loss, or that longing for a place to belong. Maybe you've wondered if hope could return after everything seemed broken. Stories like this remind us that healing is possible, that families can be found, built, and cherished in ways we never expected, and that sometimes the people who were meant to walk beside us appear at the exact moment we're ready to open the door. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey, or gave you hope for the one still ahead, we invite you to become part of our community. Subscribe to the Retold Stories, where every tale is a reminder that resilience, kindness, and love are still alive in this world. Share your experiences in the comments, because your story might be the one that helps someone else believe again. At the Retold Stories, we're building more than a channel. We're building a circle of hope, a place where no one has to feel alone. Join us, and let's keep rewriting what family, love, and connection truly mean.